Biography and dialogue. A history of distance, departure, and abandonment of all thrones, and cultural dialogue is a true thirst for freedom and justice. 1. The history of distance, exit, and abandonment of all thrones. If you ask the seed about the elements of soil and food that entered into its formation until it became a tree and then ripened into a fruit, it would tell you. There are thousands of elements, even millions. So what about a human being who lives to write, live, and breathe, and to record on paper his experience with himself, his era, and his reality? It is, therefore, a process that began in the cradle of consciousness, when it began to open its eyes and learn the first and most important art for every writer worthy of this name, which is the art of seeing, and it will not end, except in one of the fading and extinguishing, that is, with the completion of formation with death. And since God's mercy wanted to extend the thread of a limited fragile life, and to preserve and renew it at every moment, it is also difficult for me to talk about a formation that is still subject to growth and withering, development and decline, and openness to the surprises of every new thing that shakes it, or brokenness, bitterness, and frustration with every painful thing destroys it and uproots it from its roots. Add to this difficulty that the one who writes these words is not satisfied with writing, or rather, he was not destined for the blessing of devoting himself to it. His life was divided, and also torn apart, by the profession of teaching philosophy, which it required for a living, and we work today more than ever before. How bitter and cruel it is, for more than a quarter of a century filled with difficulties and annoyances that he tried to overcome and control in various literary and intellectual attempts that continue to exist, ongoing. He says teaching philosophy, not philosophy itself. Education has become in universities that no longer carry the concept of the university and its mission beyond the name, a massive and futile torture. As for philosophy itself, it remains love and support, and from its wisdom, comprehensiveness, and accuracy of its methods in analysis, interpretation, change, and enlightenment, what was reflected in his works, or at least this is what he hopes for. Finally comes the last difficulty. Writing about composition necessarily involves writing about one's career or biography, with the danger of falling into the pits of inflation and swelling, and their symptoms that have spread like epidemics in recent years among most of our Arab writers and intellectuals, especially after the defeat that we called a setback, and with the absence of freedoms, the truth, and the increasing imbalance in the relationship between the ego and the other. Therefore, it is necessary to seek forgiveness from God and ask forgiveness from the reader for every talk about the self that constantly threatens him with the misfortune of falling into these abysses and diseases, especially when he is pushed to defend self from the factors of destruction and frustration that besiege it, and from the disasters of civilizational suicide, in which the collective self has become involved. I touched on parts of my biography in Creations published a few years ago, and in most of the stories, plays, and articles I wrote, and even in most of the research I wrote and quoted in translations, to which what could be described as a long confession applies, and what the creative critic called the great Shukri Muhammad Ayyad wrote in a recent issue of this magazine entitled Salvation Through Writing. Since I intend to continue with the will and help of God, I have no choice but to mention some of the constants that I believe have contributed to a formation that is still renewed, as I said, and threatening at the same time. 1. Abdication of the throne. The first of these constants is what I like to call abdication. I do not know where or when I read that writing is a kind of abandonment of all thrones, and I do not know if this is just a belief that stems from my nature and is necessary for my formation. Renunciation here immediately suggests the truth of Sufism that was defined by the early Muslim ascetics and Sufis when they said that it is abandoning all relationships and adhering to truths. It also reminds us of the same word around which the deepest contemplations and spiritual wanderings of the German mystic Eckhart from the 13th century 1260 to 1328 AD revolve. In his language, it is related to another word that means contentment, tranquility, and tranquility. By renunciation, I do not mean its apparent or superficial meaning, such as being away from power, position, fame, money, lights, benefits, and interests. Perhaps this distance or distancing is an expression of a failure that justified itself with incapable wisdom. Rather, I mean abandonment in its original religious meaning of annihilation and pure worship, and in its philosophical meaning of sufficiency and dispensation, which was the ideal of the philosopher in the ancient world, and in my opinion, it still deserves to be the ideal and highest value of every true writer. That is why I am never ceased to be amazed at the exhaustion of some of those who call themselves writers or thinkers on fame, access, noise, pop, and appearances in pictures and in media outlets, and their eagerness to have choirs or, let us be more frank with the reality of what is happening around us, so we say paralysis. They have drums resounding with praise and acclaim, and desperate efforts are made in presenting, interpreting, and analyzing works, most of which are doubted to rise to the level of art or thought, or contain any real aesthetic or human value. Originality is oppressed just as modernity is oppressed, gossip and hallucinations abound, and a felony is committed. We cannot forgive the old that we still do not know, and the new that we have not understood well, and the vessels of corrupt politics ripen torrents of tyranny, ignorance, and confusion, and the desolate orchards of literature, art, and creativity, except for some rare trees and lonely flowers and unholy processions of locusts of the ignorant, the pretenders, the opportunists, the clever, the brokers, and the entrepreneurs are crawling over them, writers of all the waves, and the real is lost in the midst of the fake, and the values are drowned in the flood of printed matter and publication, in which one can hardly find the knowledgeable and fair critic who distinguishes the wheat from the wheat. If the eye of criticism, knowledgeable, fair, and creative, as I said, was correct, it would be possible to expel the intruding locusts and purify the orchard that is about to be destroyed. It becomes a large cemetery on which false thrones of false kings are erected, and everyone realizes that the horse of glory is the one seeking the knight he deserves, so he bows his beautiful head to him and offers him his golden saddle. There is no need to mention examples from other cultures and literatures in our days. It is enough to mention the names of Zaki Nagid Mahmud and Nagid Mahfuz among other names, whose number may not exceed the fingers of 2 hands or 1 hand. After this digression, I retrieve the threads and say that I believe in silent and honest work in the shadows. Whether some appreciation comes during my life, after my death, or not at all, it is enough for me that I gave up, devoted myself to the best of my limited ability. I say it, and there is not a single drop of bitterness in the soul's table. Abandonment is a law of life and a principle of formation, and it is never and will never be a sign of inability, cunning, or arrogant humility. It remains my life's motto. If there is a slogan, it is to live in silence, work in silence, and die in silence. How happy I am to be surrounded by ignorance, because it provides me with the necessary freedom, and freedom is my first and last issue. Giving up all thrones is associated with a chronic feeling of guilt that makes me question myself with every inhalation. Do I deserve the air I breathe? And with every blink of an eyelid, have I done anything today that allows me to sleep with a clear conscience? It is true that I spent every night hearing a phrase that my mother, may God have mercy on her, used to repeat. Oh, good luck to the one who spends the night as an oppressed person or the one who spends the night as an oppressor. Socrates also said it in his famous defense when he affirmed that he would rather bear injustice than inflict it on others. But who among us is the oppressor and who is the oppressed? Where are the lines between guilt and innocence? There is no doubt that the guilty poet has committed other sins against others, but perhaps he can be forgiven for saying that he did not intend injustice, nor did it intend it. Perhaps he is allowed to say that his feeling of guilt, and thus his constant torture of himself, has a biological origin. She was born the third of 3, and the 2 sides of the triangle preferred to leave the weakest and most emaciated of them after the 2nd month of their birth. The feeling of guilt towards the 2 absent or sane brothers has haunted me ever since I heard the story from the mouths of my mother and older sister, and I was known to wander romantically in my youth among the graves of the town cemetery, searching for the graves of the 2 poor little ones and for the remaining inch that our neighbor, the reciter and the atheist, had prepared to accommodate the 3rd thin body. His luck or cunning, for a reason he did not understand and did not deserve, wanted him to remain after the reciter, the mother and father, 2 dear brothers, and 2 older sisters, and he was punished and beaten because of this. Only tours how much he remembered her when he grew older, and he used to read graveyard poetry in its dark, sad literature. The spoiled boy whose birth was linked to a miracle or an ironic irony grew up in a country house that raised him with values that he increasingly regretted after living in complex, cunning cities and after the ferocious attacks of the inferior on our reality, our society, our science, our literature, and our consciences. If the optimistic belief that there are among us today is permissible, conscience remembers, between a strict pious father, who was harsh on himself in his commitment to integrity and absolute duty, as if, as I later learned, he was a rural Kantian, even if he had never heard of Kant, and a kind, caring mother who was miserable from before dawn until deep sleep with the evening prayer, and who possessed a rare ability to love and give unconditionally, limits even to lose a bite in her mouth and on propaganda, fun, telling examples, stories, and imitating others. Between them and two brothers who help the father who devotes himself to worshipping and reading the only book he has read in his life in his simple trade, and two other brothers who study in the magical, distant and frightening cities, and who only appear during the summer vacation. Between them the dreamer and the little sinner were formed, and his experiments with poetry from which he went bankrupt began. Completely at the age of 20, even though he remained faithful to poetry in the thousands of pages he wrote later on poetry itself and in the stories and plays he attempted, he still insisted on committing his sins in them, and even in the studies he presented in world and Western literature and in Eastern and Western philosophy, which made one of the young critics test his intelligence in him and describe him with the famous description of Al-Twidi, the writer of philosophers and the philosopher of writers, that is, nothing at all. 1 to 2. Distance and exit. If the first phrase in the book of Genesis is "in the beginning was the word," and the first word expressing the life of Goethe, the master of German poets whom I will talk about in a moment, is "in the beginning was the deed," then it seems that the word that confirms it isn't "it started with torture." It was implanted in my conscience from the early years that I was suffocating in a stifling world that is hell, and the necessity of getting out of this hell and being loyal to it at the same time, and being sheltered by its fire settled in. I left it a lot to other countries and worlds, but I carried it with me wherever I went, and I lived in it and was consumed by its fires and its demons for most of my life, but I did not stop trying to get out of it, reject it, protest against it, and plunder it while I was in it. Perhaps it was an alienation that was always searching for belonging, or a belonging that only found itself in alienation. Whatever the case, I constantly sought other horizons and shores, and always aspired to know other languages, literatures, and civilizations until my lifelong friend Salah Abdul Saber called me Al-Tala. More than I ever aspired to keep my feet firmly planted on my land and to deepen my language and heritage, I rose and went west as much as my only boat and my weak wings helped me in order to reflect, in my 6th decade, on a truth that I declare frankly to young writers and scholars. A person will not know the heritage of others if he remains ignorant of his own heritage, and he will not master the languages of others until he masters his own language. Perhaps the desire to distance myself and leave began at the age of 3 or 14 after reading the thought leaders Taha Hussein and Zarat al-Omar al-Hakim. But it certainly took root in my upbringing when I read The Passion of Werther in the translation of Al-Zayyat. May God have mercy on him, from the French. At that time, like every Egyptian boy, I was still crossing the bridge of Manfaludi tears, and by chance I came across this unique book, which became the first literary text I devoted myself to. After that I began a serious start in learning German, and its author was destined to become a guiding star for my thinking and my life for 30 years or more, and to be known for his literature and poetry, and to have him and his studies translated into at least 3 books. At that stage, I was fascinated by the eloquence of Al-Rafi and Al-Zayyat, influenced by my brother Al-Azhari and his colleagues, who accustomed me to setting my weekly biological clock to the Tuesday on which the message appeared. As I remember, I emerged from the strife and fascination with them and their generation of rhetoricians whose eloquence I am still trying to escape to today, to fall into the magic of Gibran, who wrapped his net around me until I obtained guidance. The wise man extended a lifeline to me, and he transferred the idea of the idealist and his precise dialogue from rhetoric to art. At university, the desire to distance myself and go out returned, with the insistence on mastering English and French, and with the generous care of Badr al-Deeb, Mohammed Amin al-Alam, and Yusuf al-Sharauni, who pledged their love and guidance to me during my first years at university. I looked at what I could of Maeterlinck's plays and the stories of Kafka, whose nightmares do not leave me to this day, and the poems of Rilke and Eliot, and various fragments of what was written or translated by existential philosophers and writers, whose voices began to resonate among intellectuals in general and students of philosophy in particular, such as Camus, Sartre, Marcel, Heidegger, and Jaspers. From the beginning, I imbibed the tragic or tragic tendency and the renewed thirst for nature, light, and life. Then the feeling of love for him and the connection with his pessimism, innocence, honesty, and rebellion stayed with me until I prepared my dissertation on his philosophical thought more than 10 years later. As for the fifth, Heidegger, the tyrant's control took control of my mind. His illusory magic seduced me, and his difficult thought and complex, broken style exhausted me throughout the years that I spent in a German university where most of its professors and students submitted to his tyranny, and that long preoccupation resulted in a book that I think is one of my worst books, even if it is not the least useful, is The Truth Call. And if I differ from him in the areas of my thinking and expression that are far different, then my acknowledgement of his gratitude and my knowledge of his person and knowledge runs in my blood, and it is sufficient for his virtue to me and to others. that he will remain the high example by which we are guided in going out and challenging this desire to get out of hell to other horizons and shores, while insisting, as I said, on belonging to it and embracing the fire of its love and the love of its victims, has, I believe, been reflected in my philosophical thinking and literary production. Not a few years ago, I was overwhelmed by the feeling of the plight of Arab existence that is no longer hidden from anyone, and I began to get rid of the influence of the philosophy of existence and move to criticize and plunder the existing reality and reject its values that I mentioned before under the influence of the philosophers of rejection and negation who hold critical theory. Socialists known as the Frankfurt philosophers. If this criticism appeared initially in my humble book Why Philosophy, and its project has not yet been completed, it was evident from a literary standpoint in my cryings and in quite a few of my plays, such as The Hero, The Tears of Oedipus, Barefoot Bisher Emerges from Hell, and The Yellow Caesar, as it was embodied before in most of the characters in my stories who were extracted from the beloved hell that we created for ourselves and whose images and types varied from dervishes, failed actors, beggars, madmen, hermits, ungrateful teachers, frustrated revolutionaries, etc. Which of the poor people of and people in the shadows acknowledges the gratitude of our great writers closest to my heart, who is our gentle and venerable sheik with the stick and the lamp, zombies, and teachers' friends. Perhaps all of the above is linked to two other constants that I do not think this place will allow us to expand on them. The dead fathers from whom I learned and lived with them more than I lived with the living, and the lifelong friends whom I accompanied and who accompanied me for more than 40 years, and they were and still are the living and the teachers. As for the dead, I would be wrong if I called them the dead. Their eyes look at me and look at me, perhaps they pity me. From the folds of books that surround me, my wife and my child from every side, they encourage me, answer my questions, and offer me love, loyalty, and security whenever the people closest to me at this time are stingy with it. Most importantly, they are the only ones standing by my side at this time when I feel the most distress and crisis. The crisis of my country, my history, and my civilization, not the crisis of my accidental, inevitably fleeting personality. They are mostly philosophers, poets, and philosopher poets,